A retired Navy SEAL stepped into an abandoned house during a snowstorm and froze. In the corner, a woman in a nun's coat was barely alive, shaking, starving, and hiding from the world. She wasn't homeless by accident. She was cast out, blamed for a sickness killing children, accused of offending God himself, and the town wanted her gone forever. But what they didn't know was that she carried a truth powerful enough to destroy a church built on lies. And this soldier had already seen what fear can do to innocent people. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter tightened its grip on Spokane, sealing streets, faith, and mercy beneath layers of snow. In the forgotten edges of the city, one woman learned how quietly a community could turn away. Sister Mary Caldwell had always believed that silence was sacred. In the convent, silence meant prayer. In the sick room, it meant listening. In moments of grief, it meant respect for pain that had no words. But the silence that followed her expulsion was something else entirely. It was not sacred, it was empty, and it followed her through the snow like a second shadow. She sat alone in an abandoned house at the edge of the city, where the wind crept through broken boards and the floor held the cold like a memory it refused to forget. The building had once belonged to someone. There were signs of ordinary life left behind: a cracked mug, a curtain hanging by one hook, a child's shoe near the door. Now it belonged to no one. Or perhaps it belonged to her because no one else wanted it. Mary wrapped her arms around herself and tried to slow her breathing. She had been trained to endure discomfort. Long nights, hunger, exhaustion, these were familiar companions. What she had not been prepared for was abandonment that came dressed as righteousness. The city had changed in a matter of weeks. First came the sickness. It moved quietly through the poorer neighborhoods, touching the smallest and the weakest first. Children burned with fever that refused to break. Elderly men and women faded with alarming speed, as if something inside them had been drained away. Clinics overflowed. Supplies ran thin. Fear spread faster than the illness itself. Mary had stayed. She stayed when others suggested prayer alone would be enough. She stayed when volunteers quietly stopped showing up. She stayed when whispered warnings followed her down the hallway of the church-run shelter. She cleaned wounds. She cooled foreheads. She listened to confessions that had nothing to do with sin and everything to do with terror. At night, when exhaustion finally forced her to sit, she prayed, not for miracles, but for clarity, for understanding, for the strength not to turn away from what frightened her. That strength, she would later realize, was precisely what made her dangerous. Mary pressed her palm against the cold floor now and closed her eyes. Her mind replayed the moment everything shifted, as it often did when she tried to rest. It had been subtle at first, a change in tone during evening services, sermons that lingered longer on punishment than mercy, on obedience rather than compassion. Father Gregory Walsh spoke calmly, confidently, with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. He spoke of trials, of faith under pressure, of impurity as an invitation for suffering. People listened. Mary remembered standing near the back of the church, tired but attentive, feeling a strange tightening in her chest as familiar words were bent into unfamiliar shapes. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself fear could make anyone mishear. Then the looks began. Not from everyone, never from everyone, but from enough people that she felt them, even when she did not see them directly. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Parents pulled children closer. Questions were asked that sounded harmless on the surface and carried accusation underneath. Why were you always with the sick? Why did the illness seem to worsen in some places and not others? Why did you insist on helping when prayer should suffice? Mary answered patiently. She had been taught patience as a discipline. She believed misunderstanding could be corrected with time and kindness. She did not realize that a story had already been written for her. The meeting where she was asked to leave was brief. No formal charge, no chance to speak in her own defense. Just carefully chosen words about propriety, order, and the greater good. She was told it would be best for everyone if she stepped away for a while, that her presence had become complicated. Mary remembered nodding, remembered thanking them, remembered the strange calm that settled over her as she folded her belongings into a small bag. Only later, walking into the snow, did her hands begin to shake. Now, in the abandoned house, the shaking returned, not from fear alone, but from the effort of holding herself together. She wondered how easily trust could be reshaped into suspicion, how quickly a lifetime of service could be rewritten as transgression. She thought of Father Thomas Reed. His face came to her with painful clarity, kind eyes, a voice that never rushed. He had believed her when she said the illness did not feel like a curse. He had believed her when she said faith and reason did not have to be enemies. He had believed her when belief itself had begun to feel dangerous. Where he was now, she did not know. That uncertainty pressed on her chest more heavily than the cold. A sharp gust rattled the loose window frame. Snow slipped through the gap and melted against her skin, cold enough to sting. Mary pulled her coat tighter and let out a slow breath. She told herself she had made the right choice by staying with the sick as long as she could. She told herself that being sent away was not the same as being wrong. Still, doubt crept in. Had she missed something, said too much, trusted the wrong people? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers, only fatigue. Outside, the sky darkened. Another storm was coming. Mary could feel it in the air, in the way the silence thickened, in the way the city seemed to withdraw even further from its own edges. She did not know how long she could stay here. She did not know where she would go next. She only knew that returning was no longer an option. Mary bowed her head, not in formal prayer, but in something quieter and more fragile. "If I am wrong," she whispered to the empty room, "show me. And if I am not, then do not let this be the end." The wind answered by howling louder. Somewhere beyond the frozen streets and darkened houses, the storm gathered strength, and unseen by her, far beyond the limits of her fear and her solitude, a path was already beginning to bend toward her, slowly, silently, carried on unfamiliar footsteps through the snow. A blizzard closed in over Spokane's outskirts, swallowing roads and reason alike, driving strangers toward forgotten places where chance encounters could no longer be avoided. The wind struck the abandoned neighborhood with sudden violence, pushing snow sideways, erasing the thin line between street and sidewalk until the world became a single, shifting white mass. Sister Mary Caldwell felt the change before she heard it, the pressure in the air tightening, the cold sharpening, as if it had found new purpose. The house she had taken refuge in groaned under the gusts, its walls answering the storm with tired creaks, and for a brief, irrational moment, she wondered if even this fragile shelter would soon reject her the way people had. She moved closer to the interior wall, not because it was warmer, but because it felt less exposed, and tried to steady her thoughts as she had been taught, counting her breaths, grounding herself in the present. She told herself that surviving the night was enough, that she did not need answers now, only endurance. Yet her mind refused to rest, circling the same quiet fear, that she had not simply been asked to leave the church, but erased from the moral map of the city itself. Outside, the storm intensified, and with it came a sound that did not belong to the wind, a low crunch of footsteps forcing their way through deep snow. Mary's body tensed, instinct overriding reason. She had learned quickly that isolation invited danger as easily as it invited neglect. When the door pushed open with effort, snow spilling inside like a living thing, she did not scream. She could not. She watched frozen as a man stepped in, clearly startled to find someone already there. He moved with the restrained awareness of someone trained to notice small changes, and beside him came a presence that radiated alertness and resolve rather than threat. The man introduced himself simply as Michael Hayes, explaining in few words that he had been caught in the storm while returning from the outskirts, that this house had offered the nearest cover. His voice carried no judgment, only caution shaped by experience. Mary said her name just as simply, leaving the rest unsaid, unsure how much truth she could afford to carry aloud. Michael seemed to understand that some stories arrived in pieces, or not at all. Without pressing her, he set down his pack, removed bread and a thermos, and placed them within her reach with a gentleness that caught her off guard. The dog, whom he called Shadow, did not approach her directly, but positioned itself between them and the door, its attention fixed outward, as if the storm itself were the greater enemy. Mary's hands trembled as she took the food, shame rising alongside gratitude, not because she was hungry, but because she had begun to believe she deserved to be. The warmth of the water spread through her slowly, bringing with it an ache that reminded her how close she had come to collapse. Michael watched without comment, not out of indifference, but out of respect for the fragile dignity of the moment. As the storm battered the house, they spoke little, yet the silence between them differed from the one that had haunted her since her expulsion. This silence held space, rather than judgment. Mary found herself studying Michael in brief glances, sensing a weight behind his restraint, the kind carried by people who had seen systems fail and learned to survive without trusting them. Shadow shifted occasionally, responding to distant sounds, its loyalty focused not on comfort, but on protection, a living reminder that some bonds were forged not by words, but by shared vigilance. Mary realized then how deeply she had missed the presence of someone who did not demand explanations. For the first time since leaving the church, she allowed herself to consider that being cast out did not mean being alone forever. As the storm showed no sign of relenting, Michael mentioned a cabin farther north, more secure, a place where weather was an adversary he knew how to manage. Mary hesitated, the instinct to refuse help rising automatically, but exhaustion softened her resistance. She did not agree, not yet, but she did not say no either. Outside, the wind howled with renewed force, and Shadow's attention sharpened, ears angling toward a distant sound that did not belong to the storm, leaving Mary with the unsettling sense that this night was not finished with them, and that survival might soon demand more than shelter alone. The storm loosened its grip on Spokane, leaving behind a frozen quiet where secrets felt heavier than snow, and the past waited for words it had long been denied. Morning arrived without light, only a dull gray pressing against the broken windows. Sister Mary Caldwell woke with a stiffness that reached beyond her body, as if her thoughts themselves had frozen overnight. The abandoned house still held the cold, but the storm's violence had passed, replaced by a silence that felt watchful rather than peaceful. Michael Hayes was already awake, seated near the door, his attention outward, as if the world beyond the walls demanded constant negotiation. Shadow remained close, not seeking affection, only purpose, and Mary sensed in the dog the same quiet readiness she felt in Michael, a shared understanding that danger rarely announced itself clearly. It was in that guarded calm that Mary realized she could no longer keep everything inside. The night before had been about survival. This morning demanded truth. She began slowly, choosing words with care, not because she feared judgment from Michael, but because she feared hearing the story spoken aloud might make it irreversible. She told him that the sickness in the neighborhoods had never felt like a plague to her, that something in the pattern had been wrong from the beginning. Fevers that did not respond as expected, weakness that spread unevenly, animals falling ill before people. She spoke not as an accuser, but as someone who had spent years learning to listen to what bodies tried to say when fear drowned out reason. Michael did not interrupt. He had learned long ago that premature conclusions were a luxury soldiers could not afford. Mary explained that while others prayed for relief, she had begun to test assumptions quietly, asking questions that did not sit well in a place desperate for simple answers. Without permission or ceremony, she had taken water samples from the taps that served the poorest blocks, carrying them herself beyond the city to a small laboratory that owed her no allegiance. When the results came back, they did not speak in metaphors. The water was contaminated, poisoned not by fate or faith, but by neglect and concealed decisions. She remembered the moment she held the report in her hands, the paper trembling as if it too understood the weight of what it revealed. It was not fear she felt then, but urgency, because truth, once known, carried responsibility. She had shown the results only to Father Thomas Reed, trusting him because he had never treated compassion and reason as opposing forces. Together they had planned to take the evidence to the city authorities quietly, believing the church would want the truth corrected before more lives were harmed. That belief, Mary admitted now, was her greatest mistake. Father Gregory Walsh discovered the report before they could act. He did not rage. He did not deny. He smiled, the way people do when they decide a problem must be buried rather than solved. He told her gently that she did not understand the larger picture. That scandal would destroy faith faster than illness ever could. That some truths required silence for the greater good. When Mary refused, when she insisted that sick children were not an acceptable price for institutional stability, the narrative shifted around her with frightening speed. The contamination vanished from discussion. In its place appeared a different accusation, one easier for frightened people to grasp. She was accused of violating her vows, of forming an inappropriate bond with Father Thomas Reed, of inviting divine punishment through personal sin. The illness was reframed not as a warning of human failure, but as God's response to her moral collapse. Mary told Michael how quickly people accepted this version, how it relieved them of the responsibility to confront something they could not control. She spoke of Father Thomas being removed, silenced, sent away under the pretense of reflection, and how his death on the road was turned into proof that heaven itself agreed with the lie. As she spoke, Mary felt the familiar mix of guilt and anger rise within her, the cruel irony that telling the truth had made her the villain in a story designed to protect power. Michael finally spoke then, not to question her account, but to name what she had avoided saying. He told her he had seen the same pattern in different uniforms and different languages, how institutions under threat often sacrificed individuals to preserve the illusion of order. Shadow shifted at his feet, sensing the change in tone, the dog's focus narrowing as if recognizing an invisible line had been crossed. Mary felt something inside her settle, not because the pain lessened, but because it was no longer hers alone. Yet with that relief came fear. She realized that by sharing this truth, she had bound Michael to consequences he had not chosen. She told him she did not expect his help, that she would leave once she could move safely, that surviving this far did not give her the right to endanger someone else. Michael listened, then shook his head slowly. He said little, but what he said carried weight. He told her that once a truth existed, ignoring it did not make anyone safer, only complicit. He mentioned his cabin, remote but known to him, a place where they could think without being watched. Mary hesitated again, torn between the instinct to disappear and the growing realization that disappearance was exactly what had been demanded of her from the beginning. Shadow moved closer to her this time, not touching, but present, its calm steady, in a way that suggested a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. Outside, footsteps crunched faintly in the snow, too deliberate to belong to drifting ice, and Michael's attention sharpened instantly. Mary felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on her chest, as she understood that the truth she carried was no longer merely dangerous in theory, and that staying hidden might soon become impossible. Night fell hard over the forest outside Spokane, and with it came torchlight and voices, dragging the city's fear through snow and trees toward a place that had never asked to be found. The sound returned before Mary Caldwell could convince herself it was imagined, slow at first, then unmistakable, boots pressing into frozen ground with intent rather than hesitation. The cabin Michael Hayes had brought her to stood rigid against the wind, logs creaking softly as if bracing themselves for what approached. And in that moment, Mary understood something with a clarity that cut deeper than fear. Hiding had only delayed this. She felt her pulse rise, not in panic but in recognition, the same sensation she had felt weeks earlier when whispers inside the church began to take shape. Shadow reacted before either of them spoke, moving to the door, body tense with purpose, not aggression, as if its loyalty demanded readiness rather than violence. Michael's posture changed as well, the quiet domestic stillness of the cabin giving way to something older and sharper, a discipline learned in places where hesitation cost lives. He did not rush. He checked the windows, listened, calculated distance and numbers by sound alone. Mary watched him, struck by the contrast between the simplicity of his movements and the complexity of the moment they carried. She wanted to speak, to apologize for bringing danger into a space that had offered her safety without conditions, but the words stayed lodged in her throat. This was the consequence she had feared since sharing the truth, not because she doubted it, but because she knew how fiercely lies defended themselves when exposed. The voices outside grew louder, no longer careful, emboldened by numbers and righteousness. Mary caught fragments through the walls, her name spoken not as a person, but as a symbol, a warning, a justification. Shadow let out a low sound, not a growl meant to intimidate, but a signal, a living alarm tuned to threat rather than noise. Michael gestured for Mary to move, guiding her toward a concealed hatch beneath a rug worn thin by time. His eyes met hers briefly, steady and unyielding, and in them she saw no doubt, only resolve. She wanted to refuse, to stand beside him, to face the accusations openly, but another part of her recognized the strategic mercy of his insistence. Survival, she was learning, was not cowardice. It was resistance delayed until it could matter. She lowered herself into the narrow space beneath the cabin, the earth cold and close around her, jars of preserved food lining the walls like silent witnesses to a life built far from judgment. Above her, the hatch closed softly, sealing her away from the voices that now demanded entry. The knock that followed was not polite. It was a declaration. Michael answered without raising his voice, stating calmly that they were on private land, that no one inside had business with the city tonight. The response came quickly, fueled by conviction rather than logic, accusations sharpened by the comfort of collective certainty. They spoke of sin, of contamination, of a woman who had offended God and invited punishment upon the innocent. Mary pressed her hand against the earth, feeling the vibration of their words more than hearing them, each syllable striking with the weight of history repeating itself. She wondered how many times before a crowd had convinced itself that cruelty was obedience. Michael's replies were measured, refusing escalation, refusing surrender. He did not argue theology. He did not defend Mary's character. He spoke only of boundaries and law, of land and rights, of the simple fact that no one had authority to enter by force. The tension stretched, fragile as ice underfoot. Shadow remained near the door, unseen by Mary, but felt through the subtle shift of air, its presence a constant reminder that loyalty could be quiet and still unbreakable. A voice Mary recognized rose above the others, unmistakable, even through the walls, confident and practiced in command. Father Gregory Walsh did not shout. He did not need to. His tone carried the assurance of someone accustomed to obedience, framing the pursuit as a moral duty rather than a personal vendetta. He spoke of mercy offered and refused, of repentance denied, of the danger of allowing corruption to hide in the wilderness. Mary felt a familiar ache spread through her chest, not because the accusations surprised her, but because she recognized how carefully they were constructed to absolve everyone listening. Michael answered him directly then, his voice firm, stripped of courtesy. He told the priest that faith did not grant permission to trespass, that fear did not create authority, that tonight no one would cross his threshold. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with decision. Mary held her breath, counting heartbeats the way she had during long nights in sick rooms, waiting for a fever to break or a child to breathe evenly again. She wondered if this would be the moment when everything ended, not in fire or spectacle, but in a brief, violent misunderstanding justified afterward by prayer. Instead, the silence broke with retreat. Boots shifted, voices argued in lower tones. Someone suggested returning with law enforcement, with warrants, with daylight. Father Gregory's voice closed the exchange, promising this was not finished, that truth would reveal itself in time. The footsteps receded, leaving behind a quiet so sudden it felt unreal. Only when the sound was gone did Mary allow herself to breathe fully. The hatch opened, and Michael extended his hand, helping her back into the cabin without ceremony. Neither spoke for a long moment. The danger had passed, but the meaning of it remained, settling into the space between them like frost. Mary realized that this was no longer about her exile alone. By standing in that doorway, Michael had chosen a side, not out of belief, but out of refusal to let fear dictate action. She told him she would leave at first light, that she would not wait for them to return better prepared. Michael shook his head, already anticipating her words, and said they would leave together before dawn, while the forest still favored those who understood it. Shadow shifted closer to Mary, its calm presence reinforcing the decision as something inevitable rather than heroic. Outside, the trees stood silent, heavy with snow, and Mary understood that the path forward would not lead back to the city, at least not yet, and that the truth she carried had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Before dawn reached the forest, the cabin emptied into shadow, and two lives slipped away from the city's reach, guided by instinct, silence, and snow. They left while the world still held its breath. The sky was a dull, unfinished gray, light enough to reveal shapes, but not intentions, and Mary Caldwell felt the strange weight of stepping away without farewell, as if leaving quietly might keep the past from noticing. Michael Hayes moved ahead with purpose, not haste, choosing paths that bent away from roads and certainty alike. Shadow followed close, attentive not to commands but to patterns. The dog's focus narrowed to the language of scent, sound, and threat, a way of seeing the world that required no faith in human systems. Mary struggled at first to keep pace, her body still recovering from weeks of cold and hunger. But she said nothing, unwilling to slow them, unwilling to ask for accommodation in a world that had already decided she was a burden. Each step forward felt like a small act of defiance against the version of herself that had learned to disappear quietly when pressure mounted. The forest closed around them, trees heavy with snow absorbing sound, transforming movement into something private and deliberate. Mary realized how unfamiliar it felt to move without being watched, to exist without interpretation, and the relief frightened her almost as much as the danger they fled. Michael said little, but his presence was constant, adjusting their route when the terrain shifted, stopping when Shadow signaled something subtle in the air. Mary sensed that for him, This vigilance was not new, only repurposed, the habits of survival carried over from conflicts that no longer wore uniforms. She wondered what it had cost him to learn such restraint, what moments from his past surfaced when the forest demanded silence and readiness. At one point they paused near a frozen stream, Michael testing the ice with measured care before allowing them to cross. Mary watched his movements, the balance between caution and trust, and recognized a discipline born not from fear, but from responsibility. As they moved deeper north, the city's influence thinned, replaced by a landscape that asked nothing of them beyond respect. Mary found her thoughts drifting despite herself, replaying the night at the cabin, the sound of voices pressing against walls, the certainty in Father Gregory's tone as he promised this was not over. She knew then that escape was not an end, but a postponement, a necessary distance to gather strength rather than surrender. That knowledge carried both comfort and weight. They stopped briefly to rest in a hollow where the wind could not reach them fully. Michael shared what food he had, reminding her quietly to eat slowly, a practical instruction that carried unspoken care. Mary obeyed, surprised by how quickly trust had formed not from shared beliefs, but from consistent action. Shadow remained alert even while still, its presence grounding, a reminder that protection did not always announce itself loudly. As they resumed their journey, Mary felt something shift internally, a loosening of the rigid self-blame that had haunted her since her expulsion. She had been told repeatedly that leaving was her fault, that her refusal to remain silent had invited chaos. Yet here, moving through a world indifferent to church and city alike, that narrative lost its grip. The forest did not punish her for asking questions. It did not accuse her of moral failure. It simply existed, demanding awareness and honesty in return. Michael spoke at last, briefly, about where they were headed, mentioning a small community farther north, people who lived between worlds rather than within institutions, veterans and laborers who valued contribution over conformity. He did not promise safety, only distance from immediate pursuit, and Mary appreciated the absence of illusion. Promises, she had learned, were easily broken when they conflicted with convenience. As the day stretched on, fatigue returned, deeper this time, not sharp but insistent. Mary stumbled once, catching herself before falling, embarrassment flaring instinctively. Michael stopped without comment, giving her time to regain balance. And in that small pause, she felt the difference between pity and respect. No one apologized, no one reassured. They simply continued. The rhythm steadied her, the repetition of movement replacing the spiral of thought. Still, curiosity lingered beneath the exhaustion, an unease that refused to settle. Mary wondered how long they could remain unseen, how quickly the city would adapt its search, whether law or rumor would arrive first. She wondered what price Michael would pay for having closed that door, and whether Shadow sensed that this path carried them toward confrontation rather than away from it. As dusk approached, the forest grew denser, the light thinning between branches, and Michael slowed again, scanning ahead. Shadow's attention sharpened, posture shifting in response to something Mary could not yet perceive. The air felt different, charged not with immediate threat, but with proximity, as if they were nearing a boundary not marked on any map. Michael raised a hand, signaling stillness, and for a moment the world seemed to hold itself suspended, waiting to decide whether they would be welcomed or challenged by what lay ahead. Mary felt her heart quicken, not with fear alone, but with the awareness that this journey, meant to buy time, was already shaping the ground on which she would eventually have to stand. Snow returned to Spokane like an accusation, settling over streets and faces alike as the city gathered itself for judgment, unaware that fear had already chosen its verdict. Mary Caldwell felt the city before she saw it again, a pressure in her chest that tightened as familiar outlines emerged through the winter haze, buildings rising from the white-like memories she had tried to set aside. The journey north had given her distance but not release, and when news reached the small community that children were still falling ill, that fevers had returned despite prayers and promises, she understood with quiet certainty that leaving had never been the final act. Survival without responsibility would only repeat the lie that had driven her into the snow in the first place. Michael Hayes did not argue when she said they had to go back. He listened, weighing risk the way he always did, not in absolutes, but in probabilities shaped by consequence. Shadow sensed the shift immediately, the dog's focus tightening not in alarm, but in readiness, as if this turn toward confrontation made clearer sense than continued evasion. The return was slower than the escape, not because of terrain, but because intention carries weight. Mary noticed how her thoughts changed as they approached the outskirts, how doubt gave way to a steadier resolve that surprised her. She was no longer rehearsing apologies or explanations. She was preparing to speak plainly, regardless of whether anyone wished to listen. At the edge of the city, they paused, Michael scanning the streets before proceeding, Shadow attentive to the patterns of movement that hinted at gathering attention. Rumors had moved faster than they had. People recognized Mary now not as a caregiver, but as a symbol resurrected by desperation. Word spread quickly, carried on the same channels that once spread accusation, and by the time they reached the square, a crowd had already formed, drawn by the promise of answers or the comfort of blame. Mary stepped forward before Michael could position himself ahead of her, aware that standing behind him would only reinforce the narrative that she required protection to hide wrongdoing. She felt the cold bite through her coat, grounding her in the present moment, and lifted her voice without shouting, trusting calm more than volume. She did not begin with the water or the evidence. She began with the children, naming what she had seen, the pattern of illness, the way bodies failed when poisoned slowly, the way animals had sickened first, ignored until their suffering became inconvenient. Faces shifted as recognition stirred beneath denial. Michael remained close but silent, ready to intervene if fear tipped into violence, his presence a reminder that this was not a solitary plea, but a shared stand. When Father Gregory Walsh appeared, the crowd parted instinctively, making space for authority they had been trained to accept without question. His expression was measured, almost regretful, and Mary recognized the careful construction of it, the way concern could be shaped to resemble compassion while concealing control. He spoke of disorder, of the danger of hysteria, of the need to trust leadership in times of crisis. He addressed Mary by name, not with anger, but with disappointment, as if framing her defiance as a tragic misunderstanding rather than a deliberate challenge. Mary listened without interruption, not because she agreed, but because she understood the power of allowing a lie to fully reveal itself. When he finished, she responded not with accusation, but with clarity, stating that faith did not require blindness, that prayer did not excuse neglect, and that no doctrine justified the suffering of children. She turned then to Michael, who stepped forward at her nod, producing the documents she had carried folded close to her body for weeks, the test results, the dates, the correspondence that showed how warnings had been ignored and concealed. The papers passed through the crowd, hands trembling as people recognized the language of proof they had been told to distrust. Father Gregory attempted to reclaim the narrative, questioning the legitimacy of the tests, the motives behind them. But his certainty faltered as others began to speak, parents connecting symptoms to the timeline Mary described, workers recalling changes in the water's taste, the smell that had been dismissed as imagination. Shadow stood at Mary's side, still and attentive, unaffected by words, yet deeply responsive to the shifting energy, a silent witness that steadied her more than any prayer could have. Tension rose, not in a single surge, but in ripples as doubt spread unevenly, cracking the surface of consensus. Law enforcement arrived, summoned not by outrage, but by necessity, and for the first time since the illness began, the conversation moved beyond sermons and into procedure. Father Gregory's authority shrank under scrutiny, his reassurances sounding rehearsed against the weight of accumulating detail. Mary felt a familiar pang of grief as she watched the unraveling, not because she regretted speaking, but because she knew how deeply people had needed the comfort he offered, even when it was false. As officials secured the evidence and began to ask questions that could no longer be deflected, Mary understood that truth rarely arrived cleanly. It brought relief and loss in equal measure. Michael remained beside her, his presence steady, a quiet acknowledgement that choosing to confront systems did not guarantee justice, only the possibility of it. When the crowd began to disperse, some faces softened with relief, others hardened with resentment. Mary felt neither triumph nor vindication, only exhaustion and a cautious hope she did not yet trust. She knew the city would need time to process what had been revealed, that consequences would unfold slowly, unevenly, and not always in her favor. As snow began to fall again, lighter this time, Mary looked at Michael and Shadow and felt the weight of what came next settle in her bones. Speaking had been necessary, but it was not sufficient. The systems that allowed the truth to be buried would not dissolve overnight, and the question of where she belonged after exposing them remained unanswered, hanging in the cold air as the city turned inward to reckon with what it had almost destroyed. Spring edged into Spokane slowly, loosening winter's grip while the city learned to breathe again beneath a truth it could no longer deny. When the investigations concluded, the city did not erupt into celebration or collapse into shame. It did something quieter, more difficult, and far more honest. It paused. Mary Caldwell watched that pause unfold from a distance that felt deliberate rather than imposed, standing near the edge of a community hall that had once served as a temporary clinic, now repurposed into a place where people came not for sermons or verdicts, but for care. The snow still lingered in stubborn patches along shaded streets, yet the air carried a softness she had not felt since before the sickness, as if the season itself were unsure whether it was allowed to move forward. Mary understood that feeling intimately. The evidence she and Michael Hayes had brought forward had set processes in motion that could not be undone. Officials had closed access to contaminated water lines, emergency resources had been redirected, and Father Gregory Walsh had been removed pending formal charges that no longer required whispers to sustain them. None of this brought immediate peace. Truth, Mary was learning, did not heal in a single moment. It altered the direction of pain, turning it outward, so it could finally be addressed rather than hidden. She spent her days assisting where she could, not as a representative of the church or as a symbol of defiance, but as someone who knew how to sit with suffering without flinching. Some people thanked her openly. Others avoided her gaze, still unsure whether acknowledging her meant confronting their own silence. Mary accepted both responses without protest. Forgiveness, she believed, could not be demanded, only practiced. Michael remained nearby, present without intruding, helping where practical and withdrawing when not needed. His understanding of boundaries shaped by years in which proximity and distance had been matters of survival rather than preference. Shadow stayed close, attentive to shifts in mood and movement, calm now that immediate threat had receded, yet never fully relaxed, as if experience had taught that vigilance was not something to discard simply because the noise had faded. Mary noticed how the dog responded to children especially, positioning itself quietly between them and harm, not seeking attention, but offering assurance through presence alone. In moments like these, she felt a quiet gratitude that surprised her, not because she had been saved, but because she had been accompanied without condition. As the weeks passed, the city began to rebuild trust in small, uneven ways. Community meetings replaced sermons. Doctors and engineers spoke alongside volunteers and parents. Responsibility, once deflected through faith alone, was shared reluctantly at first, then with growing resolve. Mary was asked repeatedly whether she would return to the convent, whether reconciliation might now be possible. She answered honestly that she did not know, that belonging defined by silence no longer felt like belonging at all. The question itself revealed how deeply people wanted closure, a familiar shape to restore order. But Mary understood that some stories ended not with return, but with transformation. She found herself drawn instead to the edge of the city, where Michael's cabin stood as a reminder that refuge did not require permission. Together, they began repairing a neglected building near the forest line, not with grand plans, but with practical intention. It became a place where care was offered without ideology, where those recovering from illness or exhaustion could rest without explanation. Mary worked there naturally, her skills finding purpose without title, and Michael supported the effort with the quiet competence that defined him, securing supplies, coordinating logistics, ensuring safety without spectacle. Shadow adapted as well, claiming the perimeter as its responsibility, not through dominance, but through steady watchfulness that allowed others to feel secure enough to sleep. Mary reflected often on how close she had come to disappearing, how easily the story could have ended in the abandoned house where she first met Michael, and how survival alone would have been an incomplete victory. What mattered was not that she had been proven right, but that she had chosen not to become smaller in response to fear. One evening, as the last traces of snow melted into the soil, Mary stood outside the building they had nearly finished restoring and felt something loosen inside her, a grief she had carried without naming finally allowed to settle. She thought of Father Thomas Reed, of his belief that faith and truth were not enemies, and felt the ache of loss soften into something like continuation. Michael joined her without comment, and in the shared quiet she recognized a companionship rooted not in rescue or debt, but in mutual recognition of what it meant to stand when it would have been easier to retreat. The city did not fully forgive itself, and perhaps it never would, but it learned to listen differently, to question certainty when it demanded cruelty, to recognize that protection of institutions was meaningless if it required sacrificing the vulnerable. Mary did not reclaim her former place, and she did not seek a new one defined by authority. She found something steadier instead, a sense of alignment between her convictions and her actions that no longer depended on approval. As dusk settled, Shadow moved to her side, gaze fixed outward, alert yet untroubled, embodying a balance Mary hoped to maintain within herself. The winter that had tried to erase her had failed, not because it lacked force, but because she had refused to accept the lie that survival required surrender. In the end, the snow receded, the city adapted, and Mary remained, not as a figure of controversy or redemption, but as a quiet presence committed to care, standing in a place she had chosen, rather than one assigned to her, finally free to define what faith looked like when stripped of fear. Sometimes the miracle we wait for does not arrive as fire from the sky or a voice from heaven. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet choice to tell the truth when silence feels safer, or as a stranger who shows kindness when the world has turned cold. Perhaps God does not always remove the storm, but sends strength to walk through it, and companions to remind us we are not alone. In our daily lives, we may never face a blizzard or a mob, but we all face moments where fear asks us to shrink, and faith asks us to stand. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who may be walking through their own winter. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from or what this story reminded you of. And consider subscribing to the channel so more stories of hope and courage can reach those who need them. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and grant you the courage to choose compassion over fear, truth over comfort, and light even in the coldest season.